Earlier today, I spoke to Dr. Kari Odermann. She is a political analyst based here in Kiev, and she's been tracking this conflict very, very closely. Here's what she told me. With me is Dr. Kari Odermann. She's a political commentator, and she's joining us here live in Kiev. Dr. Odermann, welcome to WION.
Thank you for having me.
The million-dollar question that everyone is asking is, will there be war?
And the million-dollar answer is there already is war. It's been going on since 2014, and this is the standard answer that you're going to hear when you talk to anyone. The question is, why hasn't international media really been focused on it until now? And that's because of the Russian troops that started coming in the spring of 2021. So there is war. There isn't going to be war. We hope the war doesn't continue for the people living here, though.
Do you feel that Ukraine's Western allies did not really live up to the promise that they made, that they said that they will keep supporting Ukraine, but then the statements that came really gave Russia the edge when the US president says we will not send troops on the ground?
You know, they say intelligence is the ability to recognize patterns, and there's been a long historical pattern of promises being made to Ukrainians and then being broken. If you go back even to the mid-90s with Bill Clinton and the Budapest Memorandum, Ukraine was, I think, the third most powerful nuclear power in the world after the fall of the Soviet Union, and they handed over the nuclear codes as part of the Budapest Memorandum, and both the United States and Russia promised that there would be no aggression towards Ukraine. So a lot of promises have been made. Now, you're absolutely right. There's a completely different tone coming out of Washington right now, and even a different tone than President Volodymyr Zelensky and his administration are using here in the city.
Today's meeting between President Putin of Russia and President Xi Jinping of China is being talked about a lot, and the fact that Moscow and Beijing have closed ranks and made a joint statement that says that US and its NATO allies pose a threat to security in the region. How significant do you think is that statement, and the fact that China has clearly thrown its lot behind Russia? Well, there was always support, tacit support, but this is a more significant sort of underlining of that support.
I think that it was extremely interesting at the Security Council meeting last week in New York when China and Russia came out strong together, and that's simply because precedences are being set in international law. What the West allows to happen here in Ukraine will then be used perhaps for China with its Taiwan question. So this is interesting that in some ways China and Russia are going to keep cooperating on this level, but in other ways they're going to continue to have their differences.
Another criticism against the US is that Joe Biden has completed 1 year in office and he's not had a foreign policy win, and he does not want to be seen as the one who's blinking first. So he wants this conflict to sort of continue to escalate, whereas there are countries like India which have refused to take sides for diplomatic reasons as well. But the fact that India has underlined the need for dialogue rather than the escalation of hostilities, how do you compare the two?
Well, first let's address India. Any country that has an unstable border issue should also be following this very carefully to see how the international community reacts. Now, whether or not Joe Biden has had a foreign policy win or not, let's consider the fact that American domestic policy is famously divorced from foreign policy. What's happening with Joe Biden's popularity in the United States has nothing to do really with what's happening outside in his actions. We have to keep in mind that Joe Biden has been in politics for over 40 years, which means he's very familiar with the Cold War, the foreign policy of the Soviet Union, and this is actually, I think, a benefit for the White House right now. Because, you know, in the early 90s, there was a lot of discussion about finding new political paradigms. How are we going to understand how the world is working now that the Cold War has ended? There's no more polarity, it's multipolarity, and what's ended up happening now is, again and again, Russia was given the benefit of the doubt. However, it continues to pursue an expansionist Soviet Union-esque foreign policy. And that is something that Joe Biden, as someone that was a senator during the Cold War, is probably more familiar with than other world leaders.
But how is he using that familiarity to his benefit? Because he seems to be giving Vladimir Putin the advantage in every single stage of this conflict, if I may.
If I had answers to how Joe Biden could make the best out of this, I think I'd be working for Joe Biden in the White House. As someone here in Ukraine, I will have to admit that it is hard to stay unbiased about what's happening. And each time the United States signals to Ukrainians that they're offering support, it is seen very positively here. And as someone whose personal security may or may not be affected by this, you can obviously tell that I would welcome that. Portraying that to the U.S. voter is unfortunately something that's very, very difficult. And as with anyone who works in media, there's a way to tell a story, and in the United States, stories are being told in a very tribal way right now. So whether or not if Joe Biden is doing the right thing or not, only time will tell. And it's hard to make any calls about his foreign policy right now. He needs more time, I think.
Dr. Odermann, thanks very much for speaking with us.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.